Hi there, my name is Ryan Dickerson. I'm a student in School Medicine Class 2025, and this is our embryo video on the pharyngeal arches, pharyngeal pouches, tongue, and thyroid development. As always, here's our mission statement for Scrubs. We are a student-driven initiative that is aiming to develop supplemental resources for current and future cohorts that will pass through Brody with the overall goal of making this a staple of the Brody student body, exemplifying our unique collaborative community. If this is something that you are interested in joining, we are always happy to have new members to help promote Brody's success. As always, we have a disclaimer with all of our resources indicating that our resources are made as a supplement to your primary course resources. However, they are in no way meant to replace the instruction of Brody faculty. So we hope these resources are helpful to you as a supplement and can help aid you in your time in the class. With that, we're going to go ahead and move in to the development of the pharyngeal arches. So when thinking about the pharyngeal arches and the pharyngeal apparatus, we really need to think about a snapshot in time. We're developing during the 4th and 5th week of life. So we're starting to see a resemblance to something that we can think of as human. We're starting to see body folds starting to form. The GI system is going to be forming around this time as well. We have the heart that's forming, and the head fold is starting to come down. And it's really this head fold coming down that is going to help develop these pharyngeal arches. So I know that it's a big jump from the trilaminar disc to the developing embryo, but that we're starting to see body structures forming. And this is kind of going to be the process that we think about throughout development from here on, starting to get to adult structures that we may recognize in the adult. So initially, we need to talk about the pharyngeal apparatus as a whole. So the pharyngeal apparatus is composed of multiple components. So we have the pharyngeal arches, and the pharyngeal arches are paired mesodermal structures that contribute to the muscles and arteries of their future derivatives. So in this image here, we're looking at the head fold, and we're taking a cross section through. These little outpouchings are the pharyngeal arches. If we take a cross section, we can see that the pharyngeal arches are composed of a couple of different things, and this is a zoomed in view. Internally, you have the mesoderm, so this is the pharyngeal arch itself. On the outside, however, you have ectoderm. This is going to be your pharyngeal groove, and the pharyngeal groove is specifically going to be the indentation around these pharyngeal arches. Internally, you have the pharyngeal pouches, and this is made of endoderm. So as a whole, your pharyngeal apparatus is going to have endoderm internally, mesoderm, and then ectoderm, most lateral or external. Right. Now we'll point out in between each one of these pharyngeal arches, so the arch is the little bump here, you have the groove and pouches, but there's a little region here of mesoderm, which we're going to call the pharyngeal membranes. And this is formed where the pharyngeal pouches and pharyngeal grooves come together, okay, forming these indentations. So as a whole, when we think about our pharyngeal arches, there are going to be 6 total arches that are formed during embryonic development. In the adult, not all of these are going to persist. In the adult, you are going to have contributions to adult structures from pharyngeal arches 1, 2, 3, 4, and 6, but not 5. So 5 is not going to contribute to any adult structures. And you're going to see that each of the pouches, each of the grooves have the potential to contribute to adult structures in the human, and we're going to talk about each one of those individually. As far as timeline goes, this is really happening during the 4th week where you're developing the pharyngeal apparatus, and around the 5th and 6th week you're starting to differentiate into actual structures that you may recognize in an adult. So differentiation of the arches, the pouches, the grooves, and the membranes. And we're going to cover each one of those in more detail in the following slides. So let's start with one of the most complex components, and that's going to be the arches. So the arches are going to have 2 different germ layers that are going to be contributing to their future development. It's going to be the paraxial mesoderm and the neuroectoderm. So the paraxial mesoderm is going to contribute to all of the muscles that are formed by the pharyngeal arches, whereas the neuroectoderm is going to contribute to all of these skeletal components. So you're going to see, and it's kind of indicated here in this image, that each one of these arches has vasculature and nervous connections. Okay, these are going to be paired with each one of these arches. So remember that there are 6 total arches, but only 5 of these are going to contribute to the adult structures because the 5th pharyngeal arch fails to complete development in the embryo. And as I said, each one of these pharyngeal arches is associated with a cranial nerve and a major vessel. So if you can learn these pairs, it will really help you out. And for instance, each nerve that is paired with a pharyngeal arch is going to innervate all of the muscles that are derived from the same pharyngeal arch. So if you know all of the muscles that are innervated by the associated cranial nerve, then you can reasonably understand the embryonic muscles that are going to be developing from these arches. And specifically, I want to point out that any motor innervation to a pharyngeal arch derivative is referred to as branchiomotor innervation. So it's a little bit different than your general somatic efferent fibers. We're going to refer to these as branchiomotor. So this is a general slide. It's not meant for you to memorize, but it's for concepts. The idea is that each one of these pharyngeal arches that we're seeing, so arch 1, 2, 3, 4, and 6, are going to give rise to structures in the human. So each one is paired with a nerve. You're going to see pharyngeal arch number 1 is paired with our trigeminal nerve, whereas the facial nerve is paired with pharyngeal arch number 2, glossopharyngeal with 3, and then the vagus has 2 different branches. The superior laryngeal branch and the recurrent laryngeal branch are going to be paired with pharyngeal arches 4 and 6 respectively. Likewise, we're going to have neuroectoderm components within these pharyngeal arches that is going to give rise to all of the muscular components. And you see that laid out here. Again, we mentioned there are major vessels that are associated with each pharyngeal arch. And lastly, there are muscles that are associated with each pharyngeal arch as well. So we're going to go through each one of these pharyngeal arches in detail in the following slides and talk about what are their derivatives and what are they going to give rise to in the adult. I know this is a lot of information, and it really requires you to have a foundation in the adult anatomy in order to really utilize this effectively. So let's start initially with the first pharyngeal arch. So the first pharyngeal arch, the way that I like to think about pharyngeal arches is I like to pair them with the nerve that is going to be deriving from those arches. And that is going to lead to the muscles that are going to be developed as well as the skeletal components. So the first pharyngeal arch is associated with the trigeminal nerve. And remember, the trigeminal nerve, represented by the Roman numeral V, is going to have 3 components, V1, V2, and V3. Specifically here, we're talking about the maxillary division, which is V2, and the mandibular division, which is V3. So if you think back to all of the muscles that are innervated by the trigeminal nerve, you'll recognize that those same muscles are going to be derived by the first pharyngeal arch. So you have all of your muscles of mastication. So your muscle of mastication includes your masseter, your temporalis, your lateral pterygoids, and your medial pterygoids. Additionally, if you recall the trigeminal nerve, you remember that it gives off the nerve to mylohyoid. And the nerve to mylohyoid innervates both the mylohyoid muscle and the anterior belly of the digastric. And you'll see both of those represented here within the first pharyngeal arch derivatives. 2 additional muscles that you might want to know are the tensor palatini and the tensor tympani. So both of the tensor muscles are derived from the first pharyngeal arch, and they're both innervated by the trigeminal nerve. Now again, all of this, the nerve of the musculature, remember this is paraxial mesoderm. When we talk about the skeletal derivatives, this is neuroectoderm or neural crest cells that are following along with the arches to form the cartilage and eventually the bone that will form these associated structures. So for the skeletal derivatives of the first pharyngeal arch, this is doing a lot of the face. So we're thinking about the maxillary process and the mandibular process. The maxillary process is going to give rise to our maxilla and our zygomatic bones, whereas the mandibular process is forming our mandible. So that's most of the structures that we see here forming the face. Additional structures that you might want to know is that we have the malleus, the incus, and the sphenomandibular ligament, all composed of first pharyngeal arch derivatives. So you see that there are a bunch of M's included in the first pharyngeal arch. So one way to remember this is all of the M's you can associate with the first pharyngeal arch. So you have the maxillary mandibular branches of the trigeminal nerve, muscles of mastication, mylohyoid, and then a bunch of the skeletal derivatives all have an M in their name: the maxillary process, mandibular process, and malleus. So that's an overview of the first pharyngeal arch, which is the most complex of all of these arches. The second pharyngeal arch is again associated with a cranial nerve. In this case, it is going to be the facial nerve. So if you think about the cranial nerve that's associated with this arch, you can think about the muscles that must be associated as well. And that's going to be all of the muscles of facial expression, because remember, the facial nerve is innervating all of these muscles. So the muscles of facial expression that you need to know, you're going to need to know the frontalis, the orbicularis oculi, orbicularis oris, the zygomaticus, and platysma, as well as the buccinator, which is inside of the mouth. A lot of people confuse this with muscle of mastication, but it's actually a muscle of facial expression. So therefore, it's going to be associated with pharyngeal arch number 2 as opposed to pharyngeal arch number 1. All right, and then thinking about the skeletal derivatives, here we're thinking about the styloid process. So the styloid process, back here on the temporal bone, We have the stapes, which is one of the small bones of the inner ear, the stylohyoid ligament, and then we also have the lesser horns of the hyoid bone. Now, why is it important to remember that it forms the styloid process? Well, one reason why this is important right here, the styloid process, is because it's also the facial nerve is innervating the stylohyoid muscle. So the muscle that's directly associated with the styloid bone is going to be innervated by the facial nerve, which is also going to be a derivative of the second pharyngeal arch. Okay, so stylohyoid also associated with the second pharyngeal arch. That includes the posterior biliodigastric, because the posterior biliodigastric, as you can see here, is running in direct dissociation. Don't confuse this with the anterior biliodigastric and mylohyoid, because as we just saw, those are both derivatives of the first pharyngeal arch, as they're associated with the trigeminal nerve. And that takes us through a general overview of our second pharyngeal arch derivatives. Going to our third pharyngeal arch, here we're thinking, instead of the trigeminal or facial nerve, we're thinking cranial nerve 9, which is known as your glossopharyngeal nerve. So that's the nerve that's associated with this pharyngeal arch, and it only innervates one muscle. And the only muscle that the glossopharyngeal nerve innervates is the stylopharyngeus. It's really important that you know that this is the only muscle that the glossopharyngeal nerve innervates, meaning that this is the only muscle that is derived from the third pharyngeal arch. And thinking about skeletal derivatives, there's really just the greater horn and inferior horn of the hyoid bone. Okay, so here we have the greater horn, and then we have the inferior horns that are kind of hard to see in this image. But overall, third pharyngeal arch associated with the glossopharyngeal nerve innervates the stylopharyngeus, which is the only muscle that it innervates. And we can see that here in green, and we can see the nerve going right over top of it. And then the skeletal derivatives, which again are formed from neuroectoderm, are the greater hyoid, or greater horn of the hyoid, and the inferior horn of the hyoid. Moving on to the fourth pharyngeal arch. The fourth pharyngeal arch is going to be one of the two pharyngeal arches that are associated with our vagus nerve. Now, it's important to note that the fourth pharyngeal arch is specifically associated with the superior laryngeal branch of the vagus nerve. The superior laryngeal branch of the vagus nerve comes down from above, and it's going to bifurcate into an external branch and an internal branch. So we can actually see that here. The external branch comes down and innervates the cricothyroid muscle, whereas the internal branch goes in and is a sensory nerve only. So when we think about the muscular derivatives of the fourth pharyngeal arch, we're thinking the cricothyroid, the pharyngeal constrictors, which we can kind of see up here at the top of this image, the levator veli palatini, and importantly, the paladoglossus. I have the paladoglossus highlighted in red here because it's important that you know that the paladoglossus is the only muscle of the tongue that is not innervated by cranial nerve 12, which is the hypoglossal nerve. So the only muscle of the tongue not innervated by the hypoglossal nerve is the paladoglossus, and that's because it is derived from the fourth pharyngeal arch, which is associated with the vagus nerve, specifically the superior laryngeal branch of the vagus nerve. Going to the skeletal derivatives, you're actually going to see that the fourth and sixth pharyngeal arches kind of fuse together to form the skeletal derivatives, but it's going to be all of your laryngeal cartilages, and that includes your arytenoids, your cricoid cartilage, your cuneate, your cuneiform, and thyroid cartilages. Okay, so that's an overview of our fourth pharyngeal arch. And remember, the paladoglossus associated with the fourth pharyngeal arch is the only muscle of the tongue not innervated by cranial nerve 12. Moving on to our sixth and final pharyngeal arch, we're going to have, again, the nerve associated, the cranial nerve 10, the vagus nerve, but now we're thinking about the recurrent laryngeal nerve, which is a specific branch of the vagus. So the vagus nerve is running down into the thorax, and on this path, as it gets on the right underneath the subclavian artery, it's going to give off that recurrent branch that's going to run up to the inferior larynx area. On the left, that same thing happens, but instead of arching around the subclavian, we're arching around the arch of the aorta and running up. And what's important here is that this nerve is innervating all of the intrinsic muscles of the larynx. Okay, so this includes your transverse arytenoids, this includes your thyroarytenoids, your vocalis, your oblique arytenoids, your posterior cricoarytenoids. All of these muscles that are intrinsic to the larynx are being innervated by the recurrent laryngeal nerve, which is why it's a really important nerve to know. But what I want you to know for embryo is that it's associated with pharyngeal arch number 6. Okay, so the recurrent laryngeal branch and all the muscles associated are associated with pharyngeal arch number 6. And again, just like pharyngeal arch number 4, the skeletal derivatives are going to be all of the different cartilages that form your larynx. Okay, I know that is a ton of information. So here's a summary table that takes you through the different derivatives of your pharyngeal arch. What I really emphasize is that pair each pharyngeal arch with a nerve. And if you can pair it with a nerve, and you understand all of the innervations for said nerve, you automatically know all of the muscle derivatives. And then the skeletal derivatives are going to be very closely associated with those very muscles. All right. And as far as germ layers, please know that the muscle derivatives for the pharyngeal arches is derived from paraxial mesoderm, whereas the skeletal derivatives are derived from neuroectoderm. And again, any muscle that receives innervation from a cranial nerve associated with these pharyngeal arches is going to be receiving bronchiomotor innervation, which is a very specific term that we use to describe the innervation to these pharyngeal arch derivatives. All right, so again, the more you compare these, the better off you'll be come test day. So that takes us through the end of the arches, which is, again, the most complicated component of this unit. Now we're thinking about the pouches, the grooves, and the membranes. So again, our pharyngeal apparatus up here that we can see, we're going to take a cross section through that, and we can see that in our pharyngeal arches we have the arch, but on the inside we have the pouch, which is made of endoderm, and the groove, which is made of ectoderm on the outside. So the pharyngeal pouches, all endoderm, and we're going to number these based off of the pharyngeal arch that is above them. So this is the first pharyngeal arch, so this will be the first pharyngeal pouch. Okay, and that goes for the grooves as well. So that means that even though there are 6 pharyngeal arches, we only have 5 pharyngeal grooves and pharyngeal pouches. All right, so there are going to be 5 pharyngeal pouches, but oftentimes this 5th pouch is going to become part of the 4th. Just like we saw the 5th arch doesn't fully form in the adult, the 5th pouch often is just a contribution to the 4th. As far as the pharyngeal grooves and pharyngeal membranes, remember the pharyngeal grooves, these are formed of ectoderm. They are going to be located down here on the external surface of your pharyngeal apparatus. And in the adult, only the first pharyngeal groove is going to persist, and it's going to form your external acoustic meatus. So again, only the first persists in the adult, and it's going to be the external acoustic meatus, and that is for your groove, which is formed out of ectoderm. Lastly, we have the pharyngeal membranes, and again, the pharyngeal membranes is this section here, where the pharyngeal groove and pharyngeal pouches really approximate one another. So you have 3 layers of tissue. You have the endoderm, mesoderm, and ectoderm. And again, just like the pharyngeal grooves, only the first pharyngeal membrane is going to persist, and this is going to form the tympanic membrane in the adult. So here is an overview of the different derivatives of the pharyngeal pouches and pharyngeal grooves and membranes. We'll start with the grooves and membranes because it's the easiest. Again, pharyngeal groove, only the first is going to persist. 2 through 5 are going to degrade. The first one is going to persist as the external acoustic meatus. Okay, and we can kind of see that here. That's this path right here. So the external ear. That is separated from the inner ear by the tympanic membrane. What is the tympanic membrane formed out of? The pharyngeal membrane, which is that union of all 3 layers. And so that is, again, the first pharyngeal membrane giving rise to the tympanic membrane. All right, so these are really easy to pair together, the pharyngeal groove and pharyngeal membrane, because only the first is going to persist. What's more likely to come up on test day, however, is going to be your pharyngeal pouches. And remember, your pharyngeal pouches is all of those endodermal components. So these are going to be forming different glands and endocrine organs, as well as different derivatives of endodermal tissue. So when we think about the first pharyngeal pouch, again, remember, the first pharyngeal groove, first pharyngeal membrane are all associated with the ear and the ear canal. So this is going to be the same here for the first pharyngeal pouch. We're going to have the auditory tube and the middle ear. So these are going to be our different derivatives from the first pharyngeal pouch. When we think about our second pharyngeal pouch, we can see that that's going to derive our palatine tonsils, which is in the back of our mouth. The one that confuses students the most is the 3rd and the 4th pharyngeal pouches, and they're the ones that you're most likely to be tested on. So the 3rd pharyngeal pouch is forming your inferior parathyroids and your thymus. So they start superiorly, but over time as you develop, they're going to migrate inferiorly. So they're forming the inferior parathyroids and your thymus, which sits lower in the neck. Whereas your 4th pharyngeal arch, it doesn't migrate as far. So here's your 4th pharyngeal pouch, and it's going to migrate inferiorly, but you see that the 3rd migrates even further. So the 4th pharyngeal pouch is actually forming your superior parathyroids as opposed to your inferior. All right, so 3rd pharyngeal pouch forming your inferior parathyroids, 4th pharyngeal pouch forming your superior parathyroids. All right, both of the parathyroid components are formed by the dorsal components of these pouches, whereas the ventral component of the 3rd pharyngeal pouch is forming the thymus, which is the structure all the way inferior below the thyroid. And then the 4th pharyngeal pouch is going to be contributing to cells of the thyroid, specifically the parafollicular cells, also known as C cells. but they are not the major contribution to the thyroid, just specialized cells within that structure. And as we said, pharyngeal pouch 5 can sometimes fuse with pharyngeal pouch 4, so we'd expect it to give rise to the same structures, and we see that here as the parafollicular cells, same as we see in the fourth pharyngeal pouch. I know this is a busy slide, but this is the entire development of the tongue all put into one place. So during tongue development, we start off from the first pharyngeal arch giving off a region of swelling that we call the medial lingual swelling. And this is, in this image, in the same region as the tuberculum empire. So this is where our initial median lingual swelling is going to form. And then over time, we're going to have the first pharyngeal arch give off lateral lingual swellings. And again, these are all derived from the first pharyngeal arch. These lateral lingual swellings are going to start to grow anteriorly, further and further, until we start to see something that looks a little bit like the anterior 2/3 of the tongue. So here's our terminal tongue development, and that anterior 2/3, this whole region here, is formed from those lateral lingual swellings, again derived from the first pharyngeal arch. Now, posteriorly, you see that there's a structure known as the cupula that forms. This is formed by the second pharyngeal arch. As the tongue begins to develop, this cupula gets overtaken by those lateral lingual swellings. And eventually, posteriorly, we're going to have something called the hypopharyngeal eminence, which is derived from pharyngeal arch 3 and 4, that is going to form and overtake this entire area. And the hypopharyngeal eminence, again derived from pharyngeal arch 3 and 4, is going to form the posterior third of the tongue. And we can see that on the adult tongue is back here. So this is the posterior third of the tongue. All right. Additionally, the posterior components of that fourth pharyngeal arch are going to form portions of the epiglottis. So now we have our terminal tongue formed. The lateral lingual swellings have formed the anterior 2/3. They join together down the midline, which is going to form a region called the median sulcus, which goes right down the middle. The junction between our lateral lingual swellings and our hypopharyngeal eminence is going to form this terminal sulcus. So we have the anterior 2/3 of the tongue and the posterior third of the tongue. And what's really important about this is because of the development, the different pharyngeal arches contributing, that gives rise to the sensation of the tongue as we know it. So the anterior 2/3 of the tongue is innervated by the lingual nerve, which is a branch of the trigem. And again, the trigem is associated with the pharyngeal arch number 1. And you can see that lateral lingual swellings are also derived from the first pharyngeal arch, which is why the anterior 2/3 of the tongue are going to be innervated by the trigeminal nerve. The posterior third of the tongue, remember that formed from the hypopharyngeal eminence, that is associated with the third and fourth pharyngeal arch. Specifically the third here, that gives the glossopharyngeal nerve innervating sensation to the posterior third of the tongue. Whereas the epiglottis, that distal region of the fourth pharyngeal arch, is giving rise, the fourth pharyngeal arch is giving rise to the epiglottis, and that's innervated by the vagus nerve. So that's, again, all of these arches correspond to the sensation of the tongue because that is how it derives in embryologic development. Now, this is all general sensation. I do want to point out that there is also taste to the anterior 2/3 of the tongue that is not mediated by the lingual nerve. Again, remember that the lingual nerve is only a sensory nerve to the anterior 2/3 of the tongue, not taste. The taste is done by the chorda tympani. So that's taste to the anterior 2/3 of the tongue, and that's due to cranial nerve 7, or the facial nerve. And you think that, Ryan, that's the second pharyngeal arch with the facial nerve. Correct, but remember that the cupula that is forming here, that is going to be a midline swelling of the second pharyngeal arch. And because it is overtaken by the lateral lingual swellings, it gets covered up, then that is one of the thought processes behind why the anterior 2/3 of the tongue is mediated by taste by the facial nerve. And again, this is just sensation. When we think about the motor innervation of the tongue, we talked about that the muscles here, they're not derived from the pharyngeal arches. They are derived from the occipital myotomes, and they're innervated by the hypoglossal nerve, which is not a cranial nerve that's associated with the pharyngeal arches. Except for one, we have the paladoglossus. And again, the paladoglossus is innervated by the vagus nerve because it is derived from the fourth pharyngeal arch, and is the only muscle of the tongue that is derived from a pharyngeal arch, and that is innervated by the vagus nerve. Everything else is going to be derived from occipital myotomes and innervated by the hypoglossal nerve, which is cranial nerve 12. Lastly, for development of this region, we have development of the thyroid gland. Now, the thyroid gland is going to start at the site of the foramen cecum, and I forgot to mention on the last slide, but the foramen cecum is right at the junction of the median sulcus and the sulcus between the anterior 2/3 and posterior 2/3 of the tongue. So it sits right in between. And so at this location, you're going to start getting what we call the thyroid primordium growing into the thyroid diverticulum. And a diverticulum is just an outpouching. So this is basically saying you have an outpouching at the base of the tongue that's going to be growing inferiorly. It continues to grow inferior until it finally gets to its terminal location right on top of the trachea. When you're on top of the trachea, it's then going to form a gland, and it's going to wrap around the trachea into our terminal thyroid gland that we're used to seeing. Now, it is important to note that there is an opening all the way through its path called the thyroglossal duct. Theoretically, this should close in adults, but it could persist as a thyroglossal duct cyst, which just means there's an opening somewhere along this path. Now, pointing out, the parathyroid glands sit posterior to the thyroid. And again, remember that the superior parathyroids are derived from the fourth pharyngeal pouch, whereas the inferior parathyroids are derived from the third pharyngeal pouch. All right. And again, the parafollicular cells of the thyroid, these are specialized cells within the thyroid. These are derived from the fourth and fifth pharyngeal pouch as well. With all of that, let's go ahead and dive into some clinical anatomy. So the first thing we want to point out is first pharyngeal arch syndromes. And remember, the first pharyngeal arch is forming a ton of stuff. It's associated with the trigeminal nerve. It's forming our muscles of mastication. It's going to be associated with our maxillary prominence and our mandibular prominence. So really, the structures that are forming our jaw and our oral cavities. So two pharyngeal arch syndromes that I want to point out are going to be Treacher-Collins and Pierre-Robins. So Treacher-Robins is going to be associated with macrognathia, meaning small jaw, retrognathia, meaning that it's pulled retrograde or closer to the posterior aspect of the skull. You get zygomatic hypoplasia because these zygomatic bones are being derived from the maxillary prominence, which again is associated with the first pharyngeal arch. And there's also some ear components as well. And you can get a cleft because the maxillary prominences are helping to form that cleft, helping to form your palate. And you get some of the similar things in Pierre-Robins. So the cleft palate, glossoptosis, meaning that the tongue's falling backwards, and then retro and micrognathia. The big takeaway here is that both of these form because the first pharyngeal arch isn't completing development appropriately. And that's because the first pharyngeal arch is giving skeletal components to the mandible, the maxilla, the zygomatic bones, and the malleus, incus, and sphenomandibular ligaments. So remember, all of these are skeletal components of the first pharyngeal arch. But also with the first pharyngeal arch, remember, all skeletal components are derived from neural crest cell migration. So it's neuroectoderm. So the takeaway here is that it's failure of neural crest cell migration that is leading to these skeletal development abnormalities. Next, we have DiGeorge syndrome, which is also known as 22q11.2 deletion. This is a pretty common thing to come up on national board exams because there's a lot of pathologic associations with DiGeorge. So the pathology here really comes down to failure of development of the third and fourth pharyngeal pouches. And so if you think about what the third and fourth pharyngeal pouches do, remember that gives rise to the parathyroid glands, the thymus, and the parafollicular cells. So if you don't have your parathyroid glands, what is that going to cause? Well, parathyroid glands secrete parathyroid hormone that helps elevate calcium. So one of the issues here is you have hypothyroidism, which is going to be this should be hypoparathyroidism, which is going to be low PTH, which gives low calcium levels in the blood. One way to the thymus, again, thymus aplasia. Thymus is associated with developing T cells, which are immune cells to help fight infections. So you're going to get frequent infections from that thymus aplasia. The cleft palate, again, goes to the pharyngeal arches not forming correctly, which also gives rise to the abnormal facies. Now, something that is not really a component of the third and fourth pharyngeal arches that makes it easy to understand is you also have cardiac abnormalities, most often tetralogy Fallot, VSD, and ASDs. So a helpful mnemonic for the symptoms of DiGeorge syndrome is catch-22, C for cardiac abnormalities, A for abnormal facies, T for thymus aplasia, C for cleft palate, and H for hypoparathyroidism. So this should be parathyroidism. And what I really want to point out is when it comes to bringing this back to embryo, it's most important that you understand the hypoparathyroidism because the parathyroids are derived from the third and fourth pharyngeal pouches. The lack of a thymus leading to frequent infection is because of third pharyngeal pouch not developing appropriately, and the parafollicular cells is again due to the fourth pharyngeal pouch not developing correctly. So those are really the big takeaways for DiGeorge when it relates back to the embryology. Last thing for this video is thyroglossal duct cyst. So I mentioned that the thyroglossal duct is the pathway from the foramen cecum, which is at the posterior aspect of the anterior 2/3 of the tongue. This is where the initial thyroid gland is going to start developing. It passes down along to its terminal location in development, and this is an open pathway. If it persists, it can form cysts anywhere along this pathway. So it can be in the tongue, they can be in front of the hyoid bone, they can be in front of the thyroid cartilage, or they could be even further inferior if there's continued migration past the thyroid gland. Last thing that I want to point out, in a significant portion of the population, we have what we call the pyramidal lobe. This is a lobe of the thyroid that is persisting because this is a remnant of the thyroglossal duct. Okay, so as it continues upwards, and that's pretty common in a fair amount of the population. And with that, that brings to an end of this video.